What even got you into prophetic healing? It's a very niche subject.
Yeah, so that's a long question. I'll try to give you a summary. But, many years ago, I used to work as a chemical engineer for Frito-Lay. And over the years, I got kind of disillusioned and saw kind of what kind of things were going on there. I literally saw how they worked with the FDA to get certain things approved that were literally even there were certain products that were even harming the public in certain ways, to be honest with you. And so over time, I started studying other things. I grew up in a really academic environment. My dad, may Allah have mercy on him, he passed away a few years ago, but he was a professor. I have an older brother who's a professor. So we used to read about all types of subjects. And then I slowly got started reading about, naturopathic medicine. So I'd read about prophetic medicine. I'd read about Ayurvedic medicine, medicine, homeopathy, and all that kind of stuff. And so the interest just kind of slowly grew from there. And then had some personal experiences, had some family members who pursued some naturopathic treatment, and just kind of grew from there. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I mean, your book, Prophetic Healing: How to Achieve Vibrant Holistic Health Using the Best of Prophet Muhammad's guidance in modern science,
Yeah.
was a great read. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't usually finish books in 2 weeks, but I was able to.
You were forced to. Yeah, alhamdulillah. No, that's a great honor. Thank you for doing so. Yeah.
Oh no, brother Sayyid Ahmad, thank you so much for
All
joining the
right.
show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. It's a
Love
pleasure to
having
be
you.
here. I've been admiring your work now for a few weeks now. I didn't know about it before that, but alhamdulillah, now I do.
Likewise,
Yeah.
likewise. And for those of you who don't know, Brother Sayyid Salahuddin Ahmad is a licensed doctor of Oriental medicine and is currently the director of Green Crescent Clinic in Dallas, Texas. He's a licensed herbalist, acupuncturist, hijama practitioner, and has trained in functional and Chinese medicine. He has a special interest in prophetic medicine and using natural methods to help heal humanity, and he's been doing so for the last 21 years. He's the author of the book Prophetic Healing, and he has a master's degree in biochemical engineering from Purdue University and was previously president of the famous Epic Masjid East Plano Islamic Center, and also the co-author of the book God, Islam, and the Skeptic Mind. Once again, Brother Said, thank you so much for joining us.
Alhamdulillah, it's a big pleasure to be here. Thank you.
When you and I spoke, I mean, I started getting excited off the bat just from the things that you started talking about. And one of them is hijama and ruqya and the 21 years of experience plus that you have in doing so. Can you tell us a little bit about what is hijama and what are its benefits?
Yeah, sure. So hijama comes from the Arabic word that relates to suction, right? And it has a history that goes back literally thousands of years. So some people may have the misconception that the Prophet ﷺ invented it. He definitely adopted it. He recommended it. He had it done on himself. But technically, he didn't invent it. It was there even prior to him. That's why you may know there's a tradition of bloodletting and cupping in traditional Chinese medicine, in ancient Greek medicine, even in the time of like Hippocrates and Galen. Even in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, they have a long tradition of using what they call leech therapy, which, leech is also suck blood, but it's for a similar purpose of like extracting blood and detoxifying the blood. So it goes way back. But when it comes to the Prophet ﷺ, yeah, I honestly feel, having looked at research over the last 20 years or so, it's one of his greatest contributions to modern health, along with other things like that we'll probably get into. But it's that useful. I mean, I know of Muslim doctors in some countries where it's pretty much revolutionized their whole practice, and it's kind of changed everything. So it's one of those techniques that was definitely practiced in the time of the Prophet ﷺ by him as well as the companions. But probably one of the most common misconceptions that I see when interacting with Muslims is they don't even know that it was mentioned in the time of the Isra and Mi'raj. Right, and that's how significant it is, right? A lot of us have maybe heard of hijama, but there's an authentic hadith in Ibn Majah that when he went up that night, right, in the Isra and Mi'raj, there is a narration that says every single angel he met told him to tell his ummah to do hijama. Alaykum bil hijama. So it's that important, and we can get into, if you like, some of the benefits and mechanisms and so forth.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
what
yeah.
what are the benefits, both spiritually and physically?
When you talk about mechanism, that gets really interesting too. Only in the last 10, 20 years have some Muslim doctors really started digging into some of the research on hijama. And I wish there was even more, but there have been studies done in, for example, in Egypt, in Iran, in Syria before the war. But one of the most interesting studies that I came across that's mentioned in the book as well was from a professor at Sohag University in Egypt. And his name was Dr. Salah Sayyad. My name is Sayyid Salahuddin, so it just happens that his name was the opposite of mine. But anyway, he did some fantastic research where he basically compared the effects of hijama to the effects of the kidney in the body. So to give you really quick background on that, the liver and the kidney are two of the primary filters, right, in the human body. The liver works more by chemical detoxification. It literally transforms things chemically. But the kidney works more by pressure gradient. So you have the blood supply that comes into the kidney and it goes into smaller and smaller tubules. You may have heard of something called nephrons. Those are the basic units of the kidney, and you have millions of them in your kidney. So as the pressure keeps increasing as you go into smaller and smaller tubules, that pressure gradient preferentially draws out certain toxins. And that's why you see in urine things like urea or ammonia, certain toxic substances that are filtered out by pressure gradient, and that's known by all doctors. So what this guy did was he said that when you apply suction or a pressure gradient to the skin, and you apply it even before doing the cuts or incisions on the skin, you do it a second time, you can even do it a third time. Every time you apply that pressure gradient, and you're doing it against the capillaries, not the deeper arteries or veins, you preferentially suck out or filter out certain toxic substances. And what he found, and he published in some published studies in the journals, is that the blood of hijama had a higher percentage of certain toxins, higher percentage of inflammatory compounds, higher percentage of certain old, like dead red blood cells. So alhamdulillah, that was one of the best studies I've seen on that. But that was one of the first studies that kind of made sense to a lot of medical professionals, that this is how it's actually working. Because some people just have the notion that blood is just blood, right? And there's partial truth to that. But when you apply that suction to it and you apply it to the capillaries, then you preferentially draw out certain substances.
Yeah, I've personally done hijama for the first time this year, and the effects that it had on me were remarkable, both mentally and physically. I was able to wake up in the morning and do the things that I needed to do. And I immediately I was fascinated. Within that week is when I hit you up and
Yes.
said, would you like to come on and talk about this?
Yeah, that
Because
was good timing. Huh?
I was shocked. I was
Yeah,
really
yeah.
shocked by the effects. Like you said,
Yeah.
within the very day you do it, you feel a
Yes.
difference. If
Yeah.
if you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you're
Exactly.
physically hurting. I know a guy who had a
Yes.
spine injury,
Yes.
and the doctor told him to give blood, like you're saying. And I was like, rather than go to the blood drive and give
That's
even
right.
the good blood away,
Yeah, yeah.
go just give the bad blood through
Yes.
hijama.
Yeah. What did you do it for?
I
Or
did it
what-
because I couldn't wake up in the morning anymore.
Oh, okay.
And then I
Just
had
too
zero
tired, too
energy.
sleepy. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
had no energy.
A lot of patients that right after doing it, you may have felt this too, say they feel lighter or looser.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And earlier, you asked about spiritual benefits. We didn't even get into that part of it, but I could quickly summarize that the Prophet ﷺ, he did recommend it even in cases of magic and envy. And that's another application that, unfortunately many of our Muslims aren't aware of. But to give you an example, in the hadith book Zad al-Ma'ad, it mentions that when the Jewish woman was trying to poison the Prophet ﷺ, right, that famous incident, afterwards he went and did hijama. He did it on his head. He may have done it on other points too, in addition to doing ruqya. So that's why most of the scholars say it can be applied in those cases as well. So that's another whole application to that. That's pretty bizarre.
And you've done hijama on people that were getting exercised? Is that
Yes.
true?
Yes, it is true. So to give you a quick background on that, I don't know if you know, do you know Sheikh Shakib, he used to be in Arlington, Texas. He used to lead a place called the Quranic Healing Center in Arlington, Texas. Unfortunately, nowadays he's had a lot of chronic illnesses, so he hasn't been able to do ruqya anymore these last few years. And may Allah give him full shifa soon, inshallah. But he used to run a Quranic healing center there, and he's a Iraqi, so he was professionally trained by some imams in Somalia to do ruqya. So he had some really severe cases of magic, jinn, ayn, hasad, and so forth, and he used to treat those patients on a regular basis. But he himself didn't do hijama and wasn't trained in it. So he used to call me over there to his office in Arlington, and we used to treat, we'd basically tag team and treat some really interesting cases. So that's where I saw in front of my own eyes, really bizarre phenomena where sometimes when people are afflicted, they react to hijama in a strong way. So to give you example, some of the patients would start either screaming, and sometimes their voice would change as they would scream. Sometimes a woman would sound like a man, or vice versa, or it would sound like a shrieking. Sometimes their arm would start banging like on a chair or table. I've seen people who had like quivering lips, or their eyes would just start convulsing. So really strange kind of reactions like that. Some of them would even become violent. But clearly in cases of like especially magic or jinn possession, they don't like that recitation of Qur'an or ruqya, but they also don't like the poking and the prodding and the bloodletting, right? Because you know how some of the hadith mentioned that the jinn can even get in like flowing in your blood, right? When they really afflict you. So yeah, I saw certain things in front of my own eyes where it's a very profound effect, and you got to be ready for it. So if you do ruqya with those type of patients or do hijama, you have to be reciting your own verses for protection and everything as well. But we've seen the manifestations of it.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. There are so many cases, but
give us a case or two.
Yeah, I'll give you one of the more severe kind of bizarre cases. Was a woman who was probably only around like 5'2", maybe like 100 pounds. Like so many cases of magic, like it's mentioned in the Qur'an, right? Ma yufarriqu bayna al-mar'i wa zawjih. So in this particular case, there was magic being done to break up this marriage. So sure enough, there were major problems in this marriage, and this woman and her husband came for treatment to Sheikh Shakib. So the particular day I was there, he had been reciting ruqya, and he was reciting ruqya strongly for several minutes. The patient was laid down inversely, face down on a table. The husband was there, I was there, and the sheikh, and we started doing hijama on her while he was reciting. She literally started getting up off the table and started screaming, and the sheikh told us to keep her down. So no exaggeration whatsoever, the husband and I were trying to physically keep her down, and both of us together couldn't keep her down. And she's, like I said, less than 120 pounds. She got up and literally started physically striking and punching the sheikh as he was reciting. And he was just trying to back off. He continued reciting. He continued reciting. He continued reciting. We were trying to back her off. This went on for about 10 minutes before she slowly just started, kind of melting. She just kind of dropped to the table and she started losing energy, right? But she started off, like I said, literally violently hitting him. And then as he kept reciting, we couldn't even finish the hijama procedure. We had started it, some blood started to extract, but we weren't even able to finish it. So it was kind of gory, but that's probably one of the more bizarre cases that I've seen. And again, it's not to scare any of your viewers or anything, but it was reality.
Can you tell me a little bit about why the Prophet, peace be upon him, recommended it when the moon was full to do hijama?
Oh, that's a good. To clarify, he actually didn't recommend it on the full moon days. He recommended it in the week after. So technically, the hadith mentioned the best dates are between the 17th and the 21st. So like 17, 19, and 21. So the
Of
white days.
Gregorian calendar
No,
or
I'm talking about
Islamic
the
calendar?
Islamic.
Oh.
So the Ayyam al-Bid are 13th, 14th, and 15th of the lunar month, right? That's the 3 white days. But then of the lunar or Islamic month, the best days for hijama are 17, 19, and 21. And this is an authentic hadith. So to give you a quick background to that, I asked many different ulama and shuyukh about it over the years. Nobody really had any clear idea, and they said there must be, something behind it. But literally about, I think probably 18 years ago, I read a book called Moon Time. It still sells even on Amazon if you look it up. Some German non-Muslim scientists wrote this book, and it's a book about the effect of the moon on the planet Earth in many different fields and realms. So it's quite interesting. But they had a whole chapter on health-related applications. So first they explained that, how it's a scientific fact that the moon and its gravitational pull exerts effects on the oceans and tides, right? When the tide comes in and out, right? That's a known fact. So they explained that just like the moon is affecting the oceans and the water on the planet, the moon is also affecting the fluid in your body. Why? Because we're also majority water, right? And so is your blood. So subhanAllah, that was the first time it kind of hit me, right? That they said that if you want to do anything that relates to extracting fluid, including blood from the body, they explained that the week after the full moon days is the easiest time to do it. Why? Because blood is more flowing, it's more exuberant, it's easier to extract. It doesn't mean you can't do hijama on other days. Like if there's an urgent need, the shuyukh say you could do it. But if you want to do it on days where it's easier to extract, then it's better to do on those days.
Yeah, and even if you look at mythologies throughout the world, whether it's werewolves or other phenomenons,
That's true.
the full moon
That's true.
is kind of the indicator of when evil arises, right?
Yes.
And I believe I heard someone say, you can check me on this, that even crime increases during the full moon, lust increases.
Yes, even certain mental health issues increase. So I've seen some research on it. There are some correlations with some things, some of them are not very clear correlations, but the ones that I've seen, and this book, by the way, mentions some of those studies. For example, ambulance visits go up on full moon days. They mentioned that hospital admissions, especially for mental health issues, go up on full moon days. So there's a slight spike then. So yeah, these are, bizarre phenomena. I mean, you look at animals, they start howling. You know how in English the word lunatic, right? Have you thought about that? That word, it comes from lunar, right? So they know that some people, it affects their psyche. So Allahu Alam, what are the wisdoms behind fasting on those days? But it could relate to that.
Didn't the Prophet, peace be upon him, advise us to fast during the full moon days?
Yeah, so we talked about hijama being recommended from the 17th to the 21st, but then the Prophet ﷺ definitely recommended, and he did it himself, fasting on the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which are the 3 white days. I've read some stuff from some scholars say, besides what we already said, they also explained that, in the old days when they didn't have all this modern lighting, when the whole atmosphere and horizon would be illuminated with the light of the full moon, that was a big blessing, right? Because normally, it's late at night and you don't have when it's not full moon, it's so dark, it's hard to do things, right? So that was another blessing that Allahu Alam, but believers are taught to give gratitude and thanks for all the blessings, including the full moon.
Yeah, my reflection on that as well is that if the Prophet, peace be upon him, recommended for us to fast if we're not married, and there's also this indication that lust increases during the full moon, and he requests us to fast during that. Might be something there.
Yeah, and obviously fasting enhances and improves self-discipline. So yeah.
Self-regulation.
Yeah, self-regulation, yeah.
Hey, if you guys want to see us get more equipment, hire more editors, and build more shows, then subscribe to our Patreon account at patreon.com/Ansari Podcast. We've partnered with Cure, the original black seed company founded by a Palestinian woman. These are some of the best gummies that I've ever had. They're black seed and honey gummies with a splash of apple cider vinegar. You can find them at cureyourworld.com or follow them on Instagram at cureyourworld and use the Ansari code Ansari15 to get 15% off. Get yours today. And you spoke about the spiritual significance of nature, especially for a Muslim.
Yes.
And on page 251, you wrote that the Prophet, peace be upon him, advised, "Verily, among the best servants of Allah are those who observe the sun, the moon, the stars, and the shades for the remembrance of Allah." And you also cited a study where interacting with animals increased mental health benefits.
Yes. Yeah, that's all true. I mean, there's so many examples. Like, first of all, from a prophetic standpoint, if you look at our tradition, the prayer times are linked to what? The position, right, of the sun. When we see the new moon, we go out to see it, right? And certainly at that time, now we have technology and everything. We don't need to get into the whole Eid discussion on sighting of the moon versus calculation and all that. But the point is, at that time, they were very much in tune with nature, right? And they were looking at things and going out and seeking the position of the sun. They were seeking the new moon and so forth. So those are examples. And then in the modern world, yes, you're correct. It's pretty much a scientific fact or consensus that interacting with animals as well as different aspects of nature have huge benefits for your own health, both physical health as well as mental health, and we would say even spiritual health. So there are studies on the benefits of having a pet and developing a strong, caring relationship with a pet or other animals. There are tons of studies looking at our interactions with elements of nature. That includes forests, mountains, water, oceans, rivers, lakes, and it's actually very significant. It's not just a small effect. Do you want to talk about, like, I think you mentioned, are you aware of Blue Mind?
Yes, I have it right. If you want to go right into it,
you could talk about that as well, because that relates to nature as well. So they've done a lot of studies that populations that live by the coast or by a lake or by a river are generally healthier in several aspects, right? And it's to the point of helping your mental health. It helps your own sleep. It even helps with respiratory conditions to be close to an ocean. And it makes sense when you think about it, like incidences of asthma are lower in populations that live by the coast. The air that they breathe in is pure. It has a little bit of salt in it, right, because of the salt water. The further you go inland and the more polluted you get, it makes sense that respiratory problems increase. But then even as it relates to mental health, just being out in nature, hiking in nature, walking out in nature, walking on grass, going into the mountains, being near lakes, rivers, oceans, those all have profound effects and benefits for health. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the study that you mentioned on page 149 about, it's an amazing study about the correlation between water and good intent, or how good intention affected water?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that study was, the actual reference is mentioned in the book, but there was a researcher named Dean Radin, right? He's with a place called the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So he's a PhD, and he did some pretty bizarre experiments where he had samples of water, and they were in California, and they were stored in rooms that were literally protective against electromagnetic radiation. So they were literally shielded rooms, right? And then he had people in Japan, thousands of miles away, who projected their positive intents on a certain number of samples. It was a double-blind study, so there were some samples that weren't projected on and some that were. So they just projected their positive thoughts or intents on these samples of water that are, like I said, are in California, right? And he ended up freezing these samples of water and looking at the crystalline pattern. You know how water, when it freezes, it forms crystals, right? So he looked at that under like electron microscopes, and they saw that it was a very aesthetically pleasing type of effect on the water when they had these people project their thoughts on it. So it's pretty bizarre. Right? That's a really bizarre one. He had some other experiments that related to water and even change. There was an electronic device, it's mentioned in the next one, that was in the water, and just by changing people's thought patterns, they were able to change the pH of the water through the mediation of these devices, but they were able to project their thoughts on it. If you want, I can mention to you an even more bizarre study that's, I can't remember if I mentioned in the beginning of the book, but there's another PhD professor named Dr. Paul Pearsall. You know, when I spoke about organ memory and cellular memory, he talks about a similar bizarre study that was conducted by the U.S. Army back in 1993. He gives the reference for it, and there's a book called The Heart Code, if any of our viewers want to look it up. Again, it's a researcher, Paul Pearsall, The Heart Code. He talks about a study done by the U.S. Army where he has a subject looking at very violent images, and they're showing him tape of very violent images. They connect a polygraph to him. They're monitoring changes as he's observing these images, right? And they record the data. Then they take some samples from his mouth, including like white blood cells from his own body. They put him in a different room, right? Isolated like in a petri dish. They again start showing him these violent images. And they see that as he gets exposed to these really violent images, and as his body starts changing in reaction, those white blood cells start changing and getting excited in the other room. Can you believe it?
What?
He mentions the reference for it. And to make it more bizarre, this will just totally blow your mind away. They repeated the experiment where they took the white blood cells, took it 50 miles away, and again subjected him to these violent images, and 50 miles away, they saw that the cells started changing as he was viewing, literally when? At the same time. So again, it kind of relates to the water thing too, but I thought I'd bring it up. But it's somehow it's honestly mind-blowing. And again, what is modern science? They don't really have any explanation. You know, some people will try to bring in, you may have heard, or some of our listeners maybe have heard of the term quantum entanglement or non-locality. They'll try to draw that principle in here to try to explain it, but even that doesn't really explain it fully. Right. And even if it were to be responsible, how, you know, why does quantum entanglement happen in the first place? Right.
I mean, I usually try not to say much on this podcast, but you're really getting me excited here. I will share one thing, which is Ibn, let's see here, where is he? Abu Bakr al-Faqadani, a scholar from West Africa, spoke about how the world was made up of atoms hundreds of years ago, if not even 1,000 years ago. And when his students were they couldn't grasp what he meant by atoms. Atoms weren't discovered on a scientific level yet.
Yes.
And he said, if Allah were to remove the veil, this is what you would see. And he grabbed sand from the ground and he blew it. And the particles from the sand that went into the sky is what he was saying, what we would see if Allah removed the veil. And as people go into quantum physics more and more, I said this on one of my earlier podcasts, is as the scientific becomes more and more advanced, it's circling back to spiritual. And as the spiritual becomes more and more advanced, it goes back to the physical, which is, you know, something scientific, experimental, objective.
That's right.
So when you're saying that, it's crazy to think about, because scientists are now starting to sound like, you know, spiritual gurus there a little
spiritual gurus. Yeah, that's true. It is very true. Yeah. And just to add to that a little bit, you know, when you look at the experiments in quantum physics, when you look at the experiments that analyzed electrons, right, you know how there's the wave particle duality, right? When they studied to see if an electron was a particle, it would behave as a particle. When they did the double slit experiment to see if it was a wave, it would always show up as a wave. So not only did it have that duality there, but they actually saw that the observer was affecting the observed, right? And some people say the wave particle duality of an electron symbolizes the material and the spiritual. Allahu Alam, but it could, right? Even at the smallest level. We have our physical bodies, which are material, but then we have our essence, which is our spirit, right? Yeah. Then when you look further, delve further into quantum physics, that thing I just mentioned, entanglement or non-locality, that just completely blows the mind of everybody, right? Including physicists, because just to quickly summarize it for some of the viewers, if you have two subatomic particles A and B, and they interact, let's say they collide. Once they've interacted in that way, particle B could go to the other end of the universe or the other end of the planet, and if particle A changes, it simultaneously affects particle B. And again, faster than speed of light. It's pretty much simultaneous. And this sounded like bizarre stuff that Einstein had predicted, but it's been actually shown by modern quantum physicists to be true. And that relates to the whole connectedness of the universe and in such bizarre ways, and the unity of the universe and the way in which Allah has created it.
Yeah, because quantum mechanics also with electrons, then you go into string theory, and string theory starts talking about multiple dimensions and how, humanity becomes blind after the 11th dimension, I believe.
Yeah.
And then you can start entering the concept of jinn into this
exactly.
and different universes.
Go down the rabbit hole.
No, that's every day I'm there. Yeah. I'm like little Alice in Wonderland in that rabbit hole every day.
Another quick comment, when you look at subatomic particles, even when you were in physics class, you probably remember, how they talked about electrons, neutrons, protons, right? And they described, how the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, how things are subatomic particles are moving around, and they're also spinning, and they're basically orbiting, and they're constantly moving, right? You can't even predict where they are, right, in this subatomic particles. But where else do you see that? Where else do you see particles like spinning, moving, rotating at the highest levels of the universe? You see planets also spinning, moving around, constant motion, right? وَفِي كُلِّ فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ, right? All the planets are in orbit, so you see it at the smallest level. The microcosm is reflected in the macrocosm, and vice versa.
And that's the whole concept of fractals right there, right?
Exactly.
How Allah, God, uses fractals throughout the entire universe.
Yes. Fractals, people see what looks like disorder, but there's order even within that perception of disorder.
Yeah.
So subhanAllah, it just blows the mind at every level. Yeah.
And the best way for anyone who's trying to understand fractals to understand it is look at a broccoli. A broccoli is just made up of tiny little broccolis.
Exactly. I like how you said that. Exactly. Yeah. It's like some people call it the holographic principle too. Have you heard that term? Where, when you look at a 3D hologram, that 3D image, if you hone in on every little image within the hologram, it reflects the whole. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh,
yeah.
No.
So every piece reflects the whole. So the human body, Allah made it in that way as well, where you go down to atomic particles. You look at the subcellular level, like into your nucleus. The nucleus has your DNA, right? And science shows the DNA reflects you as a unique being, right? So and as you come up to higher levels, so that nucleus reflects you, but then that cell in your body, and you have trillions of cells. Each cell is kind of like a little version of you, because it has a cell membrane, it has nutrients it lets in, it has waste it pushes out, it has intelligence, it knows what to do, what not to do, it has the genetic material. But a skeletal cell is not the same as a heart cell, is not the same as like a muscle cell. So they all know what to do, but at the same time, they're also reflecting you as a being, because every single cell has your DNA in it. Right, so it's again that microcosm in the macrocosm,
and that's almost the entire purpose of life, right? Is us trying to be microcosms of the ultimate macrocosm, which is Allah, and following in His path. And I think I reflect upon this quite often, which is the idea that Allah is the most generous, and in the microcosm we're trying to be finite beings as much as a finite being can be generous.
That's
You
right.
know, and that's why like Allah doesn't eat or sleep or drink, and that's why I think, and I would love your reflection on it, in
Yeah.
Ramadan is when we
Yeah.
end up closest to Allah, because our microcosm or our reflection of Allah's path becomes heightened, because we decrease sleep, we decrease food, and we decrease drink, on
That's
top
right.
of the generous, on top of the forgiving, on top of all the other characteristic traits that He would like us to embody that are originally His in perfection.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a vivid illustration of that is the fact that, all the prophets, when they received wahi, were in a state of fasting, right? So when you're in that state, that's when you're prepared to receive higher messages, right? So even us, we're not prophets, but in order to advance, in spiritual stages, we have to be able to control that lower self, or the nafs, right? And the heart can go back and forth, right? Qalb in Arabic means what flip-flops. So it can flip-flop. There's different interpretations of what it flip-flops between, but it can flip-flop between that ruh, or our spiritual essence, and our physical body, right? But that's why, in order to advance spiritually, we have to control those lower desires. We can't eliminate them, but we can at least control them.
Hey, if you guys want to see us get more equipment, hire more editors, and build more shows, then subscribe to our Patreon account at patreon.com/Ansari Podcast. We've partnered with Cure, the original black seed company founded by a Palestinian woman. These are some of the best gummies that I've ever had. They're black seed and honey gummies with a splash of apple cider vinegar. You can find them at cureyourworld.com or follow them on Instagram at cureyourworld and use the Ansari code Ansari15 to get 15% off. Get yours today. Have you ever reflected on the concept of the circle? Because I have quite a bit, especially Hajj is what really triggered that for me, as to why do we circle around,
the circumambulations.
right? And then I looked into it, and there's like studies from University of Chicago, or a philosopher, he was talking about how the circle represents wholeness, it represents renewal, it represents infinity, it represents perfection. There's no imperfection in a circle.
That's true.
And you find that in all examples of life.
Yes. And it has, how they're some people call them the spiritual numbers, right? Like pi, right? How there's pi, there's omega, there's different.
Isn't pi infinite?
Yeah,
it's an infinite number.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. Even certain numbers that are found in nature are also reflective of that divine omnipotence and the power and beauty of His creation. So there's so many. You're right. A circle reflects that in many ways.
Circle is incredible, just its reflection alone, and that's why we as Muslims need to be delving into all these subjects.
That's right.
Because Allah's knowledge is too vast for us to be like, oh, only this one thing is all I need to understand God.
Yeah, because you think about why are we asked to go around the Kaaba repeatedly and a certain number of times, right? I mean, we could just walk past it several times, right?
Yeah.
Like in Safa and Marwa, we go in a linear back and forth, right? But at the Kaaba, we go round and round.
Hamza, Yusuf spoke about that, how the Hajj represents most elements of geometry. There's a circle, there's the line.
That's right.
And then there's the point.
And the point, that's right. Yeah, subhanAllah.
You also speak about the miracles of Zamzam. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it relates to the subject we alluded to a little bit earlier about the miracles of water itself, right? Water is something that can literally be a carrier for either very positive or negative energies. Water can literally carry an infinite number or types of various energies. So what I mean by that is Zamzam water, goes back to the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam, obviously. And so many different prophets, so many different awliya, salihin used that water, right? And then forwarding to today, it's all one continuous source, right? So we believe that water can also be a means of transmission of barakah. Right?
Wasn't there a study on Zamzam that you mentioned?
Yeah, so that's what I was about to get into. And even even before I get into that, just like we know as Muslims or believers that Allah has put blessing in that. That's why when the authentic hadith say that when you drink Zamzam and you make sincere dua, any dua could be accepted. It could be a means of shifa or other things, right? So it's a means of healing potentially when you have faith in Allah and His Messenger. But we also know, for example, that water on the opposite side or flip side can carry negative energies or connotations. And what do I mean by that? So if you think back to the hadith about the companions when they were going with the Prophet ﷺ, and they passed by the Qawm or the people of Salih, right? Thamud, right? I don't know if you've seen that hadith. The companions went to get some water from the well to make some bread out of it in that area, and he stopped them. He said, no, don't use any water from that well. That well was situated right in that area where the adab had descended, right in that area. So he said, don't use that, right? So this is the opposite side. So and then, water can be used as a means of inflicting punishment too, right? After Nuh alayhi salam, the flood destroyed, so much, right? But yeah, Zamzam can carry this really positive spiritual energy. And another study I mentioned, this is another fascinating work from a Japanese scientist. His name is Masaru Emoto. He wrote 3 volumes of books called Hidden Messages from Water. So it kind of relates to that other experiment I was telling you about with Dean Radin. Remember we were talking about the water experiment? So he did experiments with water where he had people holding samples of water, and you either say things that are either very positive or negative. And he, again, froze those samples of water. He looked at the crystal pattern, and he saw various patterns. So when people said very positive, meaningful things that relate to love, peace, justice, God, he would freeze those samples, look at them, and he would see these beautiful patterns in the crystals. Whereas the opposite was also true. Like if he had people holding water and saying really hateful, horrible things, it created like chaotic patterns in the water. But the reason I mentioned this guy, in volume 3 of his book, Hidden Messages from Water, he took some pictures of Zamzam water, as well as water where Qur'an was recited next to it. He had people saying Bismillah next to water, and he published those photos. And subhanAllah, it shows these really beautiful patterns, including in Zamzam. But he's one of these kind of universalist type scientists. He's Japanese. So in that volume, he also did studies that relate to Christianity and monks who are chanting and Buddhists and so forth. But what he ended up publishing was certain images that he found when doing all that. Some of these other scientists really kind of poo-pooed him and said that, oh, your experiments are not reproducible and this and that. But again, it's another thing that's out there. But from an Islamic standpoint, we know that you mentioned ruqya earlier, right? It's well known that the raqis will even recommend that you should recite Qur'an, and you can even have water next to you. Once you recite Qur'an or you've listened to Qur'an, you can blow on that water and take that water as a means of shifa from Allah also. So again, yeah, there's a lot of things that relate.
SubhanAllah. And
yeah.
We'll be putting some of these pictures up of these water crystals that Dr. Emoto,
yes,
his name is,
yes,
discovered.
Yeah.
You speak about also in your book medical mysteries, and one of them that you speak about is organ transplants. And I'll let you say it. I won't ruin it.
Yeah, that's another whole bizarre set of phenomena. So yeah, here there's a professor named Paul Pearsall, who I just mentioned earlier. He's the one who also talked about the army experiment, right? So keep in mind, he's a PhD psychologist, I think from University of Michigan. So he's no, quack out there. He's into modern research and everything. So he put out a book called The Heart Code, and he and even other researchers, colleagues, did a ton of work on organ transplant recipients. So you might know in U.S. law, they don't really tell you anything about the donor when you receive an organ from somebody, right? They don't tell you. You just receive it and you you go about your life, right? So these people were intermediaries who went and did extensive interviews with the family of the donor, as well as the recipient and the families of the recipients. And that's when they published their findings. And it was really fascinating. They found that certain qualities were transferring from the donor to the recipient. So, for example, certain likes and dislikes when it came to the foods they would eat, the words they would use, the types of music they would like, were transferring. In some cases, there were stronger things. So in one case, they mentioned that the recipient was recalling certain memories from the childhood of the donor. Can you imagine that? And the only way they could verify this was when they talked to the mother of the donor, and they said, no, this stuff happened to my son. Can you imagine that? And then the most vivid example that I can recall in their book was the case of a policeman who was shot brutally. He was murdered by a person. He was shot in the face, right? So they took this guy's heart and put it in a woman, and they started interviewing this lady, and she said, you know, I'm getting these bizarre nightmares every night where I'm waking up in a state of terror. And she says, before I wake up, she describes this person. He's this tall, he has this kind of hair. And then she said, I see a flash in my face, and then I wake up in terror. And these researchers came back and said she was literally describing the description of the murder. And they said there was absolutely no way she could have known any of that. So again, it's just really bizarre stuff.
And you were mentioning how sometimes it's not even the heart or the mind that's an organ transplant. It could be even like a kidney.
Even others. Although it seemed from what I read that the quality transfer was kind of more pronounced or stronger with the heart. Kind of more extreme stuff. Yes.
There's also, what is it, like genetic memories, genetic traumas that get passed down. So example, if for some reason someone's deathly afraid of heights or sharks or something, it might be that they had an ancestor that survived, you know, a cliff fall or a trauma in the ocean.
That's right. Yeah, it's possible.
Do you have any more? You also mentioned Unexplained Medical Miracles by Jacqueline Duffin's book on page 37. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that one, you know, she's an author who, she comes more from a Catholic background. So she was a researcher working with the Vatican. And, you know, she came across many different stories that were narrated by the priests and people, like Catholics who would attend church and so forth. Cases of healing miracles. In some cases, people were healed from cancerous tumors. Some people were paralyzed and suddenly able to walk. You know, those type of really dramatic incidents. And she said, why don't we start documenting this? So she went back and documented like 1,400 cases, I think, that span a long, I don't know how many decades, but she started documenting it. And so she was one of the first who wrote that in the book form and collected it. But these are, again, miracles that modern science can't really explain, but they'll just come and be dismissive of it because they'll say, well, you know, there could have been other variables involved, or we don't know why, but it happened. But, you know, it's just a collection of narrations, right? But they still won't give it any real credibility. Yeah.
You spoke a lot in your book about the link between the gut and the brain.
Yes.
You spoke about it on page 45, 87, and 15.
That's like a huge area in modern medicine right now. You know, there is what they call the gut-brain axis, and there are many different manifestations of that. For example, they say there's about 500 million neurons that link your gut with your brain. The most significant of which is called the vagus nerve. You may have heard of the vagus nerve. That's a direct connection between your brain and your gut. And so various altered mental states have a very direct effect on your digestive system and vice versa. To give you further examples, some of you may have heard of serotonin. Some people call that the happy chemical, right? It's what we call a neurotransmitter that affects certain aspects of your mood. they have found that there's actually more serotonin receptors in your gut than in your brain. And you might know even antidepressant medications, many of them work on serotonin. But it's interesting that you have more receptors in your gut than in your brain. Then another huge manifestation of that I mentioned in the book relates to fecal transplants.
Before we get into that.
Yeah, if you want to get into it.
I do want to get into that.
Yes.
You mentioned on page 67,
Mm-hmm.
the Prophet's hadith, where he says the stomach is the well of the body.
That's right.
And the veins drink from it. If it is healthy, the veins pass on good health. If it is sick, the veins pass on poison. I've recently changed my diet to basically 100% healthy, as much as possible. Like, seriously, I'm pretty strict on it.
For your coffee. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I'm not on your level just yet, Doc. But I've noticed a huge difference in my prayer, in my God consciousness, my taqwa,
Yes.
alhamdulillah, in every facet of my life.
Yes.
Can you explain the link between the gut and the spiritual brain as well? Because the Prophet speaks about the stomach quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that hadith you've mentioned is very prophetic, right? In the sense that not only coming from the Prophet, but it's a prophecy too. And it's come true only in the last few decades. The ma'da, or the stomach, is symbolic of the digestive system. And as we just said, the digestive system relates to your whole body. So in modern research, they're finding, you hear about all this talk about probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics, the importance of the gut. A simple example, they found that more than 70 to 80% of the human immune system, not the digestive system, the immune system is in your gut, right? And then they're finding that even certain very complex autoimmune diseases can have their origin in gut imbalances. Autoimmune diseases include things like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, all these complex things that people are talking about. But there is actually published research. Again, they can have many different types of causes, but one of them relates to gut health. You might have heard of leaky gut. So the lining of the gut and the intestines is extremely important. But some people have an overgrowth or imbalance of microbes in their gut. So certain things start taking over, certain bacteria, certain yeast, fungus, parasites. That starts compromising the lining. Sometimes people have food intolerance or food allergy that can manifest in the gut. And then once it manifests there, it can manifest as strange reactions in the immune system, like autoimmune disease and more. As we'll talk about, gut health relates even to your mental state and treating anxiety and depression. So it's all over the place, right?
It affects every facet of your being.
Everything, yeah.
So what about the fecal transplants?
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. There's whole books out on this now, and there's so many dozens of studies. There's one meta-analysis that I looked at 21 different studies on fecal transplants as they relate to mental health. And they found in all 21 studies that they were either able to improve or worsen anxiety and depression by altering the microbes in your gut. It's a little gross as far as how they actually do it, but you can literally take a healthy person's feces and literally, you know how feces consist mostly of bacteria, right? And so you can either extract cultures from the feces or from the other healthy person's gut, and then you literally transplant that into the affected individual. So when you transplant that, you have to first kind of clean your gut out, right, to make way. But when they did that, they were able to see that they were able to, in certain cases, help anxiety and depression. In some cases, even help other types of conditions, not just mental health. They've done studies on it now for, like I said, inflammatory bowel disease. Interestingly, the number one treatment, even in the United States, even in Europe, for an infection. Have you heard of C. diff? It stands for Clostridium difficile, I believe is the name of the bacteria. It's a very severe infection. So even in America, you could go to a hospital if you're afflicted with that. even they will recommend that you should get a fecal transplant. Believe it, it's the number one treatment. It's more effective than any antibiotic, and it's another example of that.
And just to put it in simpler terms, it's basically if you take, for example, an optimistic person's poop and derive from it bacteria and make a depressed person take a pill of that person's, poop bacteria, that depressed person actually ends up more optimistic.
That's true.
Which
you could call it poop therapy.
It's called poop therapy.
Yeah.
So the scholars have spoken a lot about the stomach and the relationship between that and your spirituality. I forget which scholar, but he said that if you can conquer your stomach and your private parts, then you've conquered most of the things you need to.
Yes. Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. So yeah, there's so much that can be said about that too. So, from an Islamic dietary standpoint, there's certain fundamental principles. So there's the principle of eating what's halal and what's tayyib. These are commandments in the Qur'an itself. There's the principle of moderation, right? And there's the principle of importance of fasting. We spoke about that too. There's the importance of following the sunan of eating and drinking, right? Doing the right du'as before and after, offering gratitude. There's sunnahs of eating, for example, eating in a group, washing your hands, eating with your right hand, and so forth. The reason I bring all this up is when you eat what's halal, what's tayyib, you eat what's in moderation, when you follow the sunnah etiquettes of eating, then what's the result of that? Allah gives you blessings, right? Or greater blessing or barakah in what you eat. Because food should be something that nourishes you, gives you life, sustains you, so that we can worship Allah in the way that He deserves to be worshipped, right? And you brought that up earlier. You remember you said that when you changed your diet, it even helped with your worship, right? And the quality of worship. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatih, right? We should be, those who believe should be worshiping Allah in the way He deserves to be worshipped.
Or have taqwa for Allah, to be conscious of Allah, the amount He deserves for you to be conscious of Him.
That's right. So as you said, that quality and the type of food and drink even affects that, right? So you can imagine on the flip side, if you're eating haram food or non-tayyib food, or you're a glutton and you're eating like crazy, are you going to be able to wake up and do tahajjud? Maybe you can, but it becomes more difficult, right? And so getting that blessing in what we eat is key, because if we don't have, again, we take it for granted, but you could die from your next meal, right? You might eat some contaminated food that's got salmonella or C. diff or E. coli, and it happens every year, right? Some people die from contaminated food. There's hundreds and thousands of people who die every year from what? Contaminated water, right? So again, we don't think about it. It's one of those blessings we just take for granted. But if the point is, if we follow all these things I was mentioning, then Allah can put barakah in the food and drink, and then that can translate into proper worship, right? And enhanced worship.
Many of my podcasts lately have been subject around where's the men and women. There's no men and women anymore. Both genders are complaining about each other per usual. But one of my responses to that recently, based off some reflection, is the men and women can only rise through proper food. If a man is eating chicken nuggets and chicken tenders every day, his testosterone levels are not going to be where they need to be. He or she needs to eat more, salmon and fatty oils that are good for you, and nuts and berries and proper protein and carbs. And that allows your hormone levels to be more balanced, and that allows you to improve yourself as to whatever respective gender you are.
Yes.
So I think a lot of the hormone blockers in our shampoo, in our and you speak about this in your book, in our shampoo
disruptors,
hormone disruptors, in body lotion, in makeup, in conditioner, plastics.
You might have been, some of our listeners maybe hearing about microplastics and how huge an issue that is, but yeah, even beside the chemicals you mentioned, there are hormones in our food. Think about that too. In what, like meat and dairy, cows, chickens, they're fed growth hormone. You think that doesn't have an effect on our own hormones? That also affects it. So there's the aspect that you mentioned, like what we call chemical hormone disruptors. Some people call them xenohormones. So we're exposed to a whole barrage of thousands of chemicals that interfere with those. But then we also have certain hormones and antibiotics and things even in the meat supply and in dairy. So all of those are combining to make things much more difficult for us as human beings. And then when you look at modern agriculture, the heavy use of herbicides, pesticide, insecticide, that's right at the outset. Then even when you get a finished product, they're adding artificial or synthetic colors, flavors, preservatives, right? When you start thinking about all this, it's just, you could get depressed thinking about it, right? But it's no wonder we have so many more health issues, and there's such epidemic issues right now.
Hey, if you guys want to see us get more equipment, hire more editors, and build more shows, then subscribe to our Patreon account at patreon.com/Ansari Podcast. We've partnered with Cure, the original black seed company founded by a Palestinian woman. These are some of the best gummies that I've ever had. They're black seed and honey gummies with a splash of apple cider vinegar. You can find them at cureyourworld.com or follow them on Instagram at cureyourworld and use the Ansari code Ansari15 to get 15% off. Get yours today. You know, that's why a common Jewish parable that Jewish mothers teach their kids, or even rabbis, is a wise man once came back from battle with his soldiers and told them the battle is over, and now for the true battle, the battle within oneself. These Jewish leaders failed to tell their children is that was actually the Prophet, peace be upon him, with the Sahaba, who told them, you know, the one jihad of physical is over, and now the true jihad of within oneself.
That's right.
And earlier on, when I was starting off, I said this: I think we are struggling with the same jihad as those in the past, except ours is more mental than physical, and theirs was vice versa. A girl actually reached out to me and said, you know, do Muslim men even deserve us anymore? You know, them in the past, they used to go out in battle and fight. And I cited to her this hadith. I said, if you find you a man that is every day doing jihad against himself, battling against himself,
that's true.
Then that is a man more worthy than one just in the battlefield.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
But we have to take on that self-battle in multiple forms. What we're actually bringing into ourselves, because we are what we eat.
Yeah, we mentioned this earlier, that part of controlling the nafs also relates to controlling our diet, right? We don't often think about that. We're so obsessed with all these other issues, right? We want to, especially as guys, a lot of them want to just focus on going to the gym and pumping iron and just doing a lot of weights and stuff. But if you're eating, you know, horrible food, it's almost like you're taking one step forward, you're taking two steps backwards, right? And that's why, from a Quranic standpoint, again, we've all heard the verses about eating what's halal, but it also talks about eating what's tayyib, and that relates to this too, right? And because, you know, we have all these arguments about what's halal and haram, and, you know, is Kroger meat halal or zabiha, non-zabiha, and all that, but we're ignoring the tayyib aspect. Because we just talked about this, right? If our food is laden with artificial preservatives, colors, flavors, pesticide, herbicide, you know, you may have heard you heard about Roundup in food, the chemical made by Monsanto? You know, there's so many things that we're bombarded with. So the question arises, is that food we're eating, is that truly tayyib or not? And that's where we need to, as Muslims and as believers, be more reflective about what we're putting in our bodies, right? Yeah, it's a huge thing. And to give you a quick idea of the importance of this, the Prophet ﷺ said in a very authentic hadith, "Inna Allah tayyibun la yaqbalu illa tayyiban." Right? Allah Himself is tayyib.
Can you define tayyib? You've used it quite a bit.
I'm going to say, so Allah is tayyib, and He only accepts what is tayyib. So the common translations or connotations of tayyib relate to what's good, what's pure, what's clean, what's wholesome, right? It has all, you know, Arabic words don't just have one meaning. There are connotations of all of that. Some people, as it relates to food, will relate it to organic too, but it's generally what's good, what's pure, what's clean, what's wholesome. So Allah is describing himself that way. But then the hadith, it's a long hadith. It goes on to describe, right after that, it mentions the verse about eating what's halal and tayyib from the Qur'an. And then right after that, it gives the example of a man in the desert, a traveler in the desert, and he's disheveled. He starts making dua to Allah. But the hadith says, but this person's food is unlawful, his drink is unlawful, his clothing is unlawful, and his rizq is unlawful. So then Allah says, the Prophet says, how can his dua be accepted? So the reason I bring that up here is, again, we're not very reflective of what we're putting in our bodies. If we're eating food that's either not halal or not tayyib, I mean, that could be a source of our dua not being accepted, let alone other things, let alone being unhealthy, right? So again, it's something we really have to be much more mindful of.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to go on. I feel like I've gone on too many tangents on this episode, so I'll stop. But that's actually, that's good that means I'm really enjoying it.
Alhamdulillah.
You speak about how to deal with constant stress and the power of prayer and healing and self-regulation and patience.
Yeah.
Can you tie those all in?
I know that's a big one. Yeah. So, prayer, just like we've said already, that the Qur'an, the verses of the Qur'an are healing, right? And that's mentioned. وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ. That itself is healing, but prayer itself is also a type of therapy and healing. We tend, as Muslims, to look at it as just some type of ritual and just kind of going through the motions, right? But if you look at it from a prophetic standpoint and the way that the companions utilize prayer, we saw that it was a therapy for them. Whenever they had any kind of problem, they would utilize prayer as a means of healing. That itself is in the Qur'an. Ista'inu bis-sabri was-salah, right? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ista'inu bis-sabri was-salah. Oh, you who believe, utilize prayer, right, to seek help from Allah. So that could be for anxiety, it could be for depression, it could be for other illnesses, it could be for anything, right?
And you have a study that you cited on page 199 about this.
Yes. Yeah, so there are numerous studies about the power of prayer. Some of the non-Muslim studies look at studies on various types of meditation or contemplative practices, but there was a study done by some non-Muslims regarding specifically salah. And then there have been some conducted by Muslims themselves. But in that, they found that when people engaged in contemplative salah with khushu', with focus, with concentration, they saw that certain changes happened. They did brain imaging. They saw that there was increased blood flow to what we call the frontal lobes, and there's something called the anterior cingulate. So if you ask medical professionals about that, brain specialists, neurologists, they'll tell you that those areas are responsible for many things, but it's part of the reward system, right? So you get pleasureful feelings from doing that. But more importantly, you also, it's one of those centers that relates to emotional regulation and discipline, right? So you become more even-keeled, right? It starts helping you with your own emotional discipline. So that's been shown through these studies. Although interestingly, this is also, the people who were just kind of going through the motions with the prayer, they didn't see as much benefit.
That's what was interesting about that study.
Yeah, and that's why I bring it up again.
Basically, the non-Muslim study was basically saying, if you don't have khushu', if you don't
have...
there's no effect.
That's the world we're living in. We're telling non-Muslims, or we have non-Muslims telling Muslims to have khushu'. So alhamdulillah.
That's incredible.
It is what it is, right? But that it really is fascinating. Yeah. And then you think about prayer, it's simultaneous. You talked about, the material and then the spiritual, right? Prayer is simultaneously exercise too. It's physical exercise and it's spiritual benefit and it's helping our mental health as well, all in one. And that's the beauty of prophetic advice, is that any advice that we've gotten in Islam from Allah, from the Prophet ﷺ, are simultaneously conferring physical, spiritual, and mental health benefits. And prayer is no exception. You're going up and down 6 times, 8 times up and down, right? Your head is on the ground. You're increasing blood flow. It's almost like a little exercise, right? I mean, you talk to personal trainers, they say one of the best exercises is a burpee, right? You've heard of burpees, right? Where you're going up and down multiple times, push-ups, jumping. Granted, there's not a burpee. I'm not trying to say that, but you think about how many times you're going up and down. You're doing sajda. You go up, you go down, you go up, standing, you go back down. It's exercise. And anybody who's done Taraweeh knows that it's like a mini workout, but at the same time, it's also conferring these other benefits for us, obviously spiritually, but also mentally and in terms of our emotional health as well.
It all circles back around, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's why Ali Izzat Begovic, the man that was responsible for ending the genocide in Bosnia, he said, the only time I feel alive is when my mind, body, and soul are in sync. So, and I think that's true for anyone who's experienced that phenomenon.
That's true.
That the mind, body, and soul being in sync, whether it's in prayer when you're extremely focused, or reciting Qur'an, or having pondering with Allah. Everything that I think we're talking about, whether it's hijama, whether it's getting your diet in place, making sure your gut health, sleep, exercise, all of that is just to prepare yourself. You know, Hamza Yusuf talks about how we don't have discipline in our spiritual practices. The way we're so busy questioning whether the spirit or the soul exists that we're not getting to the next step of, it does exist. What do we do now? And the people of the past used to really ask, what should we do? Whether the soul existed or not was never in question.
That's right.
Clearly it existed. Now, how do we discipline it? And if we put the amount of discipline we do in the way into athletics, you know, into our
academics,
into our spiritual,
you'll see the difference. Exactly. But you're right. I mean, it's so hard in the modern world. You have so many obstacles where we're bombarded with cell phones, technology, computers, laptops, movies, TVs, all of it. And psychologists, psychiatrists are all saying this, including non-Muslims, that it's harder for people to focus. Right? I mean, we're talking in Salah about focusing for maybe like 5 minutes at a time, and people are having difficulty doing that. Why? Because they're hyper stimulated by all these other technologies, right? And it becomes much more difficult. But that's what makes it even more important, right? That's why it's even more important to take some time out and devote yourself to Allah and do it with mindfulness and contemplation, and then you're going to get the full benefit of it.
You spoke about cell phone radiation. Can you tell me a little bit about that? That freaked me out when I read that.
You're all over. You mentioned phones and all that. Alhamdulillah. Yeah. I mean, there are studies out there. There's something called there's a U.S. government agency called the National, I think, Toxicology Program. They did studies looking at the effects of cell phone radiation on mice and rats, and a series of experiments, a lot of them. And they were trying to simulate levels that we're exposed to as human beings, around cell phones. And they tried to, obviously take into account the difference in weights and as a different animal and so forth. But they subjected these mice and rats to this type of exposure from cell phones, and they themselves came back and said that there was increased incidences of multiple tumors, not just brain tumors, but even other types of cancer. And it wasn't just them. There's another institute in Europe that looked at the same subject and similar kind of thing. They actually came back and said that cell phones are, I think they used the word potential or possible carcinogens. It's mentioned in the study. So these are, I mean, they're admitting that, right? And so
you said
it behooves us to kind of think a little more about this.
But you said you mentioned in your book on page 277 that Dr. Paul?
Yes.
Interesting way of spelling his name.
It's Pall, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is that, Pal?
I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's done a lot of studies on it. Yeah.
He found that cell phone radiation exposure is associated with decreased sperm quality,
That's right.
Including decreased sperm motility and DNA fragmentation. That's insane.
Exactly.
What?
Insane. And to add to that, some of the study, at least with mice and rats, you can also start to look at additional generations, right? Because they have much shorter lifespans. With a human being, it's almost impossible to look at at multiple generations. But some of those slow, insidious effects that they're seeing, they can even transfer into other generations. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
Yeah, because once you have certain problems with tumors and propensity to that, they're seeing that could transfer even to the next generation. By the way, it is a little bit of a tangent, but even some of the studies on genetic engineering and genetically modified food, again, if you just look at the short term, you don't necessarily see something stand out. But when they did studies again on mice and rats and gave generations, genetically modified food, they started to see it down the line, right? So cell phones are kind of like that too. They're kind of like a slow, insidious poison that we're just not even thinking about. Again, we're just constantly pounding ourselves, and we got to be more mindful there too.
We're living in a crazy world here in the West. I wish I was joking. I mean, when I left, I realized that there's seeds in bananas. There's seeds in blueberries. There's seeds in every fruit. And we just removed the seeds. And the fruits look much different. They taste much better.
Like seedless watermelon.
Seedless watermelon. I remember when grapes had seeds.
I know.
In my lifetime, grapes have lost their seeds.
I know. I mean, I've seen kids who come to the clinic, and if you give them one with seeds, they're like, "What is that?" They don't even, because they've never seen that before.
I mean, bananas with seeds? I didn't even know that was a thing.
I know, man. It's kind of terrifying, right? And that puts even more importance, like I said, on what I was saying earlier about at least making an effort to try to access halal, what's tayyib, eating in moderation, fasting, seeking blessing before we eat. Because food, like I said, can be your biggest blessing, but it could be your biggest harm as well.
Yeah, in Christianity, gluttony is one of the seven deadly sins.
Exactly.
I mean, I heard of people that, are gluten-free or gluten intolerant in America, and then they'll go to like Italy and
better.
And they can just eat bread all they want.
I know.
Because the bread is fresh and doesn't have chemicals in it.
I know. It's crazy. But yeah, on that note too, you think about gluten and why that incidence of problems has increased. You may have heard of celiac disease. Celiac is a very severe allergy to wheat, but that's maybe 1% of the population or less. But if you look at the incidence of what's called gluten intolerance, it's very high. You know how there's like lactose intolerance? There's millions of people who are intolerant to lactose. There are millions of people who are intolerant to gluten too. And medically there's a difference. So if you're allergic, that means you're getting a full-blown immune attack against something. You might eat a food and you break into hives, or you start choking or vomiting. That's a very noticeable, what we call IgE mediated allergic response, right? But with gluten and lactose, you could get an intolerance where you may just get some bloating, you might get gassy, it might affect your stools, you might get, with gluten, some people just get really tired, some people get brain fog, some people just get some inflammation, and you don't really even know what hit you, right? And part of the reason this is getting more common is like with gluten, besides the genetic modification we talked about, we talked about that issue of glyphosate. Glyphosate is a chemical produced by Monsanto, more commonly known as Roundup, right? Roundup sells in stores. You spray it on your weeds. If you spray Roundup on a weed in your yard, you'll see it fall over dead like within seconds or minutes, right? The problem is Monsanto is selling that to farmers around the world, including here, and they spray it on their crop. It gets in the soil. It gets into the finished product. They've done published studies where you can have people eat some bread from the store or eat some cereal, and they check their bloodstream and they see glyphosate or Roundup floating around in their blood. And that substance is now a known carcinogen. It's again, hormone disruptor. That's why if you search this chemical, you'll see there are class action lawsuits all going on right now where lawyers are kind of jumping on the bandwagon here trying to sue Monsanto. But that's just one simple example. And then when you look at like lactose intolerance, we already talked about how cows are being fed growth hormone, they're being fed antibiotics, they're even being fed protein feeds. Cows are not supposed to eat protein, right? They're supposed to eat grass, right? But they're just to make them bigger, more plump. It all relates to profiteering, money. So you think that's not going to have an effect on human beings who are consuming it? You already talked about how food and how it's affecting fertility and mental health and so much more. So it all starts having a domino effect, right? You interfere with one aspect of nature, you start interfering with other aspects.
Oh, yeah. And that's why towards the end of times, one of the signs is that a man will look at another man's grave and wish he was in it. Yeah. What's happening to us, the war, the attack on us from within is one that may Allah have mercy on us and allow us to all be able to get through, because it's tough.
True. It's very true.
Sadly, we're short on time, Brother Sayyad.
No problem.
Brother Sayyad Ahmad, it was a pleasure. Amazing to have you on. I wish we had more time. Do you have any final thoughts before we head off?
No, like I said, I think overall what I'd say is the Prophet ﷺ and our religion have left us a treasure trove of wisdom. You know, it's up to us, though, if we want to utilize it, right? And we just talked about so many aspects just in this one little talk. You know, so many of us as Muslims and as believers, we're just focused on the rituals and just kind of going through the motions and just doing our own ibadah. But the fact is, Islam is a holistic way of life, right? It has to include every aspect, and food, diet, physical health also relate to spiritual health, sleep, exactly. Mental health ties into spiritual health, physical health. So again, the first step is awareness, right? They say awareness is probably more than half the battle. So if we become more aware, then we can start taking the next steps to higher levels of spirituality and worship, inshallah.
Inshallah. Brother Sayyad Ahmad, it was an absolute pleasure having you on.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you for taking the time out as well.
And thank you guys for listening to the Ansari podcast. Hey, if you guys want to see us get more equipment, hire more editors, and build more shows, then subscribe to our Patreon account at patreon.com/Ansari podcast. We've partnered with Cure, the original black seed company founded by a Palestinian woman. These are some of the best gummies that I've ever had. They're black seed and honey gummies with a splash of apple cider vinegar. You can find them at cureyourworld.com or follow them on Instagram at cureyourworld and use the Ansari code Ansari15 to get 15% off. Get yours today.